Hello, I'm going to go over our readings for the Ruins and Haunting Heritage course in general. We're not reading all of these things all at once, but we're going to be reading these things throughout this 13-week course. The first book I'm going to introduce you to is the popular press book, Shirley Jackson's The Haunting of Hill House. This is an amazing book to consider how American haunted place stories has really been solidified in movies and in novels since Shirley Jackson wrote this in 1956, that uses a lot of the same tropes as far as that places have lives of their own. One of my favorite passages in this book, depending on what edition you have, in some it's around page 84, Shirley Jackson talks about how Hill House has lots of stories to it because it's 80 years old. And in 1956, 80 years old is pretty old for America. If you're in England, 80 years old is not very old for a place at all. But she says 80 years is a long time for a house because people have to die somewhere. And our ideal that we think about, or one of our ideals about death, is dying peacefully at home. But yet nobody wants a home that they know people have died in, right? So thinking about how places hold these histories of the people who lived there before. Just going through my little stack here, the next book I'm going to introduce you to is Rodney Harrison and John Schofield's book, After Modernity, Archaeological Approaches to the Contemporary Past. And this book is about doing archaeology of the recent past that isn't about indigenous people, that isn't about cultures that are long gone, but is about the people who are doing the archaeology and the cultures they live in today, which can include indigenous people. Indigenous people are alive and thriving today. But on page 9 of my well marked up edition here, Rodney Harrison and John Schofield say that archaeology can act as both a form of exorcism by bringing to light and casting out those hidden and haunting aspects of the past. Archaeology can also be a form of redemption in reconciling communities and nations with their recent hidden histories. So we're going to be using this book for both the method and the theory of doing archaeology of recent places that you often don't even have to excavate. These are things that are on the surface and visible to us all. The next book in my stack is Yi Fu Tuan's Space and Place. And Tuan is very influential in how academics think and speak about the difference between a space and a place. So think about if you're driving down the road and there are on both sides of the road, essentially to you, nothing. But to the people who know the stories and the histories of that stretch of road, it might be where there was a massive accident and many people died. It might be where there was once a cemetery that was destroyed by the construction of the road. There might be a prison nearby. There's all sorts of things. So spaces become places when stories are told about them. And these sorts of haunting heritage and haunting histories are all about these stories that are told often by local people and people outside of academia. The next book in my stack is another archaeology book. This is Oliver Harris and Craig Chippola's Archaeological Theory in the New Millennium, Introducing Current Perspectives. And this book is awesome for teaching how archaeologists think about things, places, people, and the world in ways that are much more, dare I say, complex than most people think that how archaeologists think. The stereotype is that archaeologists just dig things up and say, look at this cool thing, and tell you how valuable it is. Whereas archaeologists look at objects differently than non-archaeologists. So we want to understand how things were made, how things were used that might be different from their intended use when they were made, how things were disposed of, why some things are destroyed and other things are not destroyed, right? So, for example, one of the chapters in here, chapter 6, is Things Make People. So, understanding the human relationship to objects. Why is it that if you see a building that is told to you that it's haunted, it's much more powerful than if somebody says there used to be a building over there, right? This ability to manifest in our imaginations through the physicality is an important part of understanding how archaeology works. The next book I'm pulling down here is Roger Clark's Ghosts, A Natural History, 500 Years of Searching for Proof. And one of the things we're going to use right away in this course is his taxonomy of ghosts, which starts on page 18. One of the things that archaeologists do that other professions don't necessarily do is we create taxonomies. So biologists create taxonomies, but they create taxonomies that they believe are natural, that they created that interpretation by learning about nature. Archaeological taxonomies aren't necessarily that they have to be something that exists apart from human beings. In fact, our taxonomies are usually about how human beings view things. So here, Roger Clark, the author of this book, says that with ghosts, there is a taxonomy. That is to say, there are many kinds of ghosts. Peter Underwood settled on 8 varieties, and this is a good place as any to start. They are as follows: elementals, poltergeists, traditional or historical ghosts, mental imprint manifestations, crisis or death survival apparitions, time slips, ghosts of the living, and haunted inanimate objects. So what are the differences between each of those categories? And what does that now mean? How does that help us understand hauntings and ghosts in a new way by creating that taxonomy? A taxonomy is meaningless if it doesn't then give you new information. Another book here is Jeb Card and David Anderson's Lost City Found Pyramid, Understanding Alternative Archaeologies and Pseudoscientific Practices. I wrote a chapter that is in here that we're going to talk about, and there's also chapters in here about reality TV programming that are going to be useful. But my chapter in here, which I should be able to find, but I'm not finding as quickly, is about ghost hunting as a form of archaeology, or archaeology as a form of ghost hunting. So my main argument is that, ghost hunters and archaeologists kind of do the same thing to a certain extent. Chapter 10 is my chapter, Ghost Hunting as Archaeology, Archaeology as Ghost Hunting, being very clear about what I'm trying to say there. We kind of do the same thing in that we go to places where things happened in the past, and we try to tell those stories about what happened there, telling those stories in the present and making them relevant to present people. Another book we're using here is another one by Jeb Card. Jeb Card there on Lost City Found Pyramid. Jeb Card here on Spooky Archaeology, Myth and Science of the Past. And this book, along with the Roger Clark Ghosts Natural History book, talks about how archaeologists have always been involved in ghost stories, especially fictional written ghost stories, but also have always been involved in the search for people from the past that includes dead and haunted places. So I'm moving back to the Shirley Jackson book for a moment to help make my point here. So we are on chapter 1 of Shirley Jackson's The Haunting of Hill House, and her main character in the book is Dr. John Montague. Reading from Shirley Jackson, Dr. John Montague was a doctor of philosophy. He had taken his degree in anthropology, feeling obscurely that in this field he might come the closest to his true vocation, the analysis of supernatural manifestations. He was scrupulous about the use of his title because his investigations, being so utterly unscientific, he hoped to borrow an air of respectability, even scholarly authority, from his education. So thinking about how the person who created, that we'll learn more about later, this idea of one of the reasons that places can be haunted is this concept of the stone tape theory, that if something very bad happens, the energy gets trapped in whatever is around, such as stone, and therefore it can be perceived and replayed through time as that energy is released. And the person who created that interpretation was an archaeologist. So my pile is getting smaller here, so we're almost done, but very important book. Michelle Hanks, Haunted Heritage, The Cultural Politics of Ghost Tourism, Populism, and the Past. So Michelle Hanks did a cultural anthropology style ethnography about ghost tourism and ghost hunting, mainly in the UK. And this book is awesome for understanding why people participate in ghost tourism and what they get out of it. And one of the important conclusions in here is that some of the people who participate feel that it is a way of creating a history that includes the average everyday people, that isn't about kings and queens and people who are fighting battles and so forth, but that it is a more democratic history, the history that you get through ghost stories. So going along with that, we have 2 local books, because Vassar is located in the Hudson Valley, and we want to use this course to understand the place that we live more. The first one is Mariana Bonchek's Spooky Hudson Valley, that a student gave to me when she graduated. Is it really fair when students give professors presents when they graduate? We should give them presents, but there are so many of them that it would be hard to do. But on the table of contents for Spooky Hudson Valley, under Part 2, East Side of the River, Chapter 9 is Poughkeepsie, and the first entry there is Vassar College. So the ghost stories of Vassar College is something I've spent a lot of time compiling into my own ghost tours, and we'll get to that later on. The last actual book I'm going to show you here is Hudson Valley Ruins by Thomas Rinaldi and Robert Yasenick, Forgotten Landmarks of an American Landscape. So I've both used this to go find some of what local lore considers interesting ruins and created small video field trips of those places for you guys. But we're also going to be using this to find some places for the investigations that you might contribute to the class, so that we could all be thinking about the same landscape when we're talking about haunted places. So I'm going to duck down for 1 second here to get one more item. This one has to be pulled out of the hidden pile because it's not an academic book, but related to the Hudson Valley. Our most famous ghost hunter and storyteller in the Hudson Valley is a woman named Linda Zimmerman, and she created a comic book about her ghost investigations. And I went to one of her talks in a local town called Goshen. And it was the place was packed. They had to turn people away. Like 200 people came out on a Sunday morning to hear a woman tell ghost stories in a library. But I got her to sign it for me because I bought it off of her. And I want you guys who can see on the video that the way she's dressed is very Indiana Jones-like in her detectiveness in this comic book strip. So we're going to be reading a lot more articles, things that aren't in bound books that are not as interesting to hold up and go over. But I wanted to give you a sense of the content of this seminar. So I'm going to end this recording there. Feel free to send me questions or comments in general about what I did choose or did not choose for course readings. But otherwise, we're going to be going through all these things in much more detail and the other readings as well. So that was a preview of what is to come.